Hey there folks, it's Glenn from Pat Glenn's Fish. Today's video is going to be a species feature on the Lake Malawi hap species, the Otopharynx Tetrastigma. Kept these for a few years now and they're pretty cool fish. I'll see you on the other side. What we're looking at here is a working breeding tank of Otopharynx Tetrastigma, 35 fish or so, housed with some rusties as a kind of a dither and a secondary species. I just mentioned the breeding tank because I am a breeder of fish, so some of the filming isn't as pristine and beautiful as you might hope for in a species profile video, but this is a tank of fish in my fish production facility, so there's some reflection, there's some glare, there's some things that we could all do without, but unfortunately it is what it is. The naming of the fish, Otopharynx, according to Google, is a Latin derivative, otto being of the mouth, pharynx being of the throat, so the throat part of the mouth part of the throat. It's not a terribly differentiating term to define the genus, so I'm not quite sure what they were thinking with that. If you go to fishbase.com, however, otto from the Greek meaning ear or hearing, and pharynx still being the throat, that kind of implies an anatomical sort of adaptation whereby the fish can hear using an adaptation of the throat, and that kind of makes more sense to me. I've seen some videos online of fish, and peacock species in particular, feeding in the wild by listening for critters moving in the substrate, and I just wonder whether that's where they were angling from when they first described the genus. The specific term, the Tetrastigma, is a bit easier to narrow down. The term applies to the four spots that appear along the side of the fish, and that's pretty clearly evident in the females, and you can see in some of the subdominant males here that the spots still apply. As far as I know, there isn't a widely accepted common name other than that implied by a couple of fish shops here and there. These guys are found primarily in Lake Malawi, and that's the general perception, but when I look at fishbase.com, they are also listed as being found in Lake Malombe, which I'd never heard of, and the Upper Shire River, which I presume feeds into probably one or other of those lakes. The preferred habitat is over sandy sort of substrate, and I've seen evidence of these guys actually burying themselves in the substrate in my tanks when I've been trying to net them, so that kind of makes me feel that they've got an instinct for that sort of habitat, and they're obviously happy around sort of rocky outcrops, reef style and plant if present. As far as size goes, most of the literature suggests these things top out at about 16 to 17 centimetres, and I'm pretty happy that that's the case in my experience. Males obviously being the bigger, the females get probably a couple of centimetres shy of that in my experience. Diet wise, I would say these guys are omnivorous towards the carnivorous side. I believe their habit is to sort of scrounge in the sand in the wild and potentially sift out invertebrates and doodads that are living down there. They certainly flip over in the aquarium situation readily onto pelletized food, and I run plant of sorts in most of my tanks when I can get it, including duckweed, and it's usually on the diminish in this particular tank, so either the rusties are eating it or the Tetrastigma or both. I believe they hit that pretty hard when they need to. With regard to temperament, I'd always like to put a few asterisk caveats on that, because no matter what the species you keep, you're always going to run into one that's crankier than what your friend down the road may experience. I strongly believe that. However, this fish I would rate as a mostly peaceful hap species. I've run them for most of my journey with a Mabuna type, and as long as that Mabuna itself isn't ridiculous, you're going to be okay. The couple of caveats I'd put, these things breed very readily, so I would look at running one male with say 4 or 5 females, and that will allow the con-specific aggression, that is the aggression within the species itself, to be spread out, and I think you'll go fine with that. But the thing to remember is that if you do breed a fish, that you give that female a chance to rest before she goes back into the tank, because that male's going to be chasing again, and whilst I don't think the aggression is out of hand, it's obviously going to be detrimental if that fish is already tired and stressed from the event of holding. And with regard to the Mabuna types, the other types, I don't rate this as an overly aggressive species to other cichlids. It will just look out for itself in a relatively calm manner, and it will stake its claim for a spot if it needs to, but generally will get out of the way if not. On water parameters, it just goes without saying that we want well filtered water, which means mature filters that are stripping out the nasty components, the ammonia, the nitrites, and getting that into the nitrate form. I'm not going to do a spiel on filtration here, other than to say that we get clean water from good filtration and consistent water changing regime. The actual parameters that work well with Lake Malawi cichlids are a high pH in the sort of 7.5 to 8.5 range. The degrees of hardness, which is a measure of your minerals and your carbonates, is also high. And we want sort of 12 to 15 degrees of hardness as a rule. And temperature, these are a tropical fish. We see in the literature that they'll sort of handle 22, 20, up to 28 degrees Celsius. Bear in mind that when you get to the outer realms of that, given that fish are what we call a poikilotherm, they have no means of regulating their body temperature for the most part, most species, and therefore colder water is going to be probably borne out with more sluggish behaviour and probably less colour. When you get to the high end, they're obviously going to be more active, have a higher metabolic rate, which has issues with feeding and so on. And also aggression is probably the key one to mention, because they're just much more active, and therefore at the ends of the spectrum, what I'm saying is you're getting into the zones where stress may result because the fish are acting outside that sort of midpoint of activity and metabolic rate. So aim for probably I would recommend 25, 26 for temperature in particular. And above all else, if you want your fish to look their best, and if you're interested in breeding as I am, you must pay respect to the minerals and so forth in your water and the parameters. You hear so many people in the hobby that think keeping Africans just means putting some bicarb and some sea salt in your water and that's it. There's a fair bit more to that, and I will be making a comprehensive video on my thoughts on building water, as I call it, to suit the purpose. Plenty of products on the shelf there in the pet shop that will buffer and mineralise your water, so I suggest that do a little bit of research and work within the realms of what these fish deserve. Sexing is easy in this particular fish, given that it's what we call dimorphic. The males are obviously coloured and a bit bigger than the females, which remain the sort of colour of what the juveniles are as well, with the silver with the black spotting. The breeding of these fish is what we call a maternal mouth brooding method. The parents will pair off and hide in a corner of a tank to spawn, and the female will lay her eggs and the male will sort of swim in behind and fertilise, and then she'll gather those into her mouth. They take about 3 weeks to incubate. We can have a good number of fry per brood, which we'll see in a minute. The key to it is, if you've got good fish to start with and you give them good food and the right water, they're going to be real easy to breed. The main factor in that is to get a good ratio of females to males. We call this harem spawning. The male obviously is going to try and pass on his genetics to as many girls as he can. That's how Mother Nature does it. And get that right and you're going to have plenty of these things. On that subject, I'm going to break in with some live footage I took recently when I last stripped down my tank to harvest, and you're going to see that these things can be hell productive when you get it right. One of the challenging aspects to working with the Tetrastigma is that they are terribly flighty fish. When you net them, they invariably will spit, and so it would be my recommendation that when you're working with this, if you've got a big number in your group like I have here, you try and catch one fish at a time so that you can deal with not having to sort out a huge number of fry. I'm just going to lift them out of the tank for a brief second. We've got loads of fish here. I'd estimate that I've just had 14 fish probably holding, and it seemed to be one or the other. It seemed to be free swimmers or eggs. Now what I'm doing here with this egg strainer, and by the way, if ever you're going to use these, I recommend the nylon variety, just because they're going to be less abrasive on your fish and on your eggs in particular. I'm just acclimating them in a tank where I'm going to let the babies out for grow on. I normally would probably go to a smaller tank, but given the sheer number of fish here, I'm hoping that they're going to aggregate in a school and we'll be able to let them out into this 95 litre grow out tank, and hopefully they'll be clever enough to find the food together. But with that sheer number, we're going to be fine, and I'm just giving them the acclimation, as I said here, so that I can lower this strainer into the water shortly, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to tease out the majority of those fry whilst leaving the eggs behind in the strainer, which I can then transfer to a tumbler. So this is mostly fry, less eggs. Unfortunately, the scenario down here is the inverse is true. So this is where a lot of fish that were holding newly formed kind of, this is where I try to dump that, but unfortunately there was times when you get a couple of fish in the net and you end up with that mix. So I'm about to, once I've dealt with that other strainer down there, I've got to do the same job here to try and decant these eggs so that I can get them into a tumbler, or I'm probably going to have to split to 2 or 3 tumblers because I've got no idea how many eggs that is, but it's a hell of a lot. So yeah, fun fish to breed, but not a fun fish to harvest unless you're maybe working with a smaller group. So keep that in mind if you're going to have a crack at these. And this is the about another week on from that bit of footage just shown. We've got I'm still sort of having to every couple of days open this egg tumbler out and let out more little baby fishies. Surprisingly, going well with not losing any there, which is great. And if you look in and around in the background, this tank's got a lot of fry here. We're feeding some fine Otophaynx here now, and the fish are doing real well. I'm sure you could give them baby brine shrimp if you want. I tend to reserve that for really special projects, but I give them a little squirt of that every now and then. We've got a couple of little rusties in here as well, and it's going to be a lot of output. It's probably too much output, and that's a whole nother subject, I guess, the ethical breeding point of view and not flooding markets and so on and so forth, but I won't get into too much of a rant there. But yeah, certainly this is probably the most fish I've ever produced in a clump. That's a young group of fish that we were breeding from, and they're obviously incredibly viable right at the minute, and this is what you can get if you get everything in order. Yeah, so I think that's about as much as I can share of my learnings over the journey with working with this species. It's certainly an attractive hap and a desirable fish for those of you that run the all-male tanks. And as I've sort of mentioned over and over, it's a rewarding project as a breeding fish. Thanks for watching if you're still with me, and I'd really be grateful if you've enjoyed the content that you could give it a like, and a sub to the channel would be great, and probably more importantly, tell a friend if you know someone that's into their fish and might find this interesting. Thanks again, and we'll see you in another one down the track.